Hey folks, Eric from Hit Subscribe here, and I am doing yet another edition of the Freelancer Weekly Q&A that I do here for the Hit Subscribe community. You may be watching this on YouTube because I don't think anybody really watches it live very often, at least not yet. We have big ambitions here, so if you're interested, feel free to join the community. There's a link in the description of the YouTube video. You can join the community and tune in live and ask me actual questions. I have done a terrible job of promoting that so far, but sooner or later we'll get that fixed. Anyway, on to the particulars of this question. So this week, the question I have up here at issue is, how risky is freelancing compared to salaried employment? That is an interesting question, a fairly open-ended one. So I'm going to kind of talk through a few different angles of this potentially. So I would say personally, my thought is, on balance, salaried employment is the riskier of the two arrangements in a steady state, but that for your average person, probably being a freelancer would be a riskier proposition. And that sounds like a very nuanced double-speak consultant answer, so I'll kind of get into why I'm saying that. So let me address, because not everybody would necessarily mean the same thing when asking a question about risk. So what do you mean by risk? And I'm not sure exactly, because the person that asked this question just posed it this way. I'm not sure what we're talking about here. So let me talk about maybe three different sources of risk when it comes to these two things. And I think that will help narrow down the frame of discussion a little bit. So first of all, are we talking about the risk of losing income? That might be the one that people would think of the most. So in a steady state, this is what I mean. If you're a freelancer, what is the risk that your income will just go away, versus if you're an employee, what is the risk that your income will go away? So that's probably the one most of you would be thinking about right out of the gate. But it could also be that you're talking about the risk of going freelance. So maybe the second source of risk would be, what is the risk that you incur by self-governing? If you are employed, for instance, your employer will tend to have sort of a paternalistic or maternalistic, whatever you want to call it, impact on your life. They are forcing you to get up and get dressed and come to a place and do stuff. And nobody's forcing you to do that if you're on your own in business for yourself. And then I would say there's also some risk of, I had made a note here, of being blasted by the unknown. So if you are working in a salaried job, this isn't so much of a thing, but if you go off on your own, what's the risk that you're going to step in it somehow when it comes to taxes or legal issues or what have you? So there is some risk associated with going into and doing business for yourself. And those are the three maybe basic categories of risk here that we're describing. So one is losing your source of income. Another would be being improperly motivated or just not being up to the challenge. And then finally, a third one would be the risk of dealing with the unknown. And the reason, and I'll get to talking about the loss of income here in a moment, but the reason I think people might perceive freelancing as risky is that those other two that are just about losing income. So the risk that it would turn out you wouldn't be very good at self-direction. And I think I've actually talked about that in a video I'll link to on YouTube at some point, what is it like to be your own boss, and might you faceplant at that? And then secondly, that risk of stepping into it, going off on your own. And those first two risks are, number one, more ephemeral. So you will deal with them once and then not deal with them anymore, assuming you get past them. And they're, number two, somewhat easily mitigated if you're so inclined before you go off on your own as a freelancer, meaning you can figure out the unknown associated with freelance, tax and all that, by moonlighting while you're employed. So you could mitigate that risk before going off on your own. And likewise, you can probably mitigate the risk of governing somewhat, either by knowing yourself or, I don't know, trying to freelance for a period of time and seeing how it goes, or by, doing it on the weekends and moonlighting in an undirected fashion or something. I'm not saying you should do that necessarily, because that means you're signing up for a lot of extra work, but you could if you were so inclined. So when it comes strictly to talking about risk mitigation, some of those risks associated with going into business for yourself you can mitigate without actually going into business for yourself full time and just plunging into the deep end. So going back a little bit and talking about these two situations, employed versus freelancing, I think some of the risk that people perceive when it comes to freelancing is from sources of unknown or mystery or whatever that aren't strictly related to the presence or absence of income. So when I was talking in the beginning about freelancing being less risky when it comes to losing your income, but more risky in terms of like the success of it holistically or whatever, that's kind of what I'm getting at. There are more obstacles in the early going for you to overcome that present sources of risk to you. But if you overcome those in a steady state, I think freelancing becomes less risky. So talking about those sources of risk aside, those initially getting going sources of risk, let's look at the risk associated with the loss of income. When you are a salaried employee, you, and I think I talked about this in my book, Developer Hegemony. It's been a few years now. If you're interested in that, I'll try to remember to put a link in the description of this episode. But you could think of being a salaried employee as sort of a unique case of freelancing. And it's a case of freelancing where you have one client and that's it. And that client probably tells you you're not allowed to have other clients. So you could look at employment that way. And when you are a salaried employee, you have a single client. And if that client were to go away, you would lose all of your income. Now, this isn't true if I think it's become more popular in recent years to develop sidelines, like Hit Subscribe itself provides a sideline to a lot of the people doing work for us. But, maybe you're an Airbnb host or you're building a website or you're driving for Uber or something. People do secure other kinds of income and then your risk isn't total. But for the most part, if you're a salaried employee, you are working exclusively for a business and that is your only source of income. And it is generally going to be your perception that business is safe, except when, if you perceive that the business is doing a bad job of being a business and, bad things are coming on the horizon, or maybe you perceive that your own status there isn't particularly safe, your boss seems to hate you or something, you will start to perceive risk in that salaried world, or maybe there's a recession coming and I'm going to direct a lot of fretting at that, even though I can't really do anything about it. How do I make myself minimally fireable? You don't have a ton that you can really do there. So the way that most employees will navigate the world is try like heck to be perceived as indispensable by the current employer. And then if such time comes as you perceive a lot of risk, you dust off your resume, start writing cover letters, start feeling out your network and trying to line, maybe something else up so that you would be unemployed for a minimal amount of time if they were to lay you off. And that is perceived as a low risk situation, but it really isn't. You exist in that employed context, or you have employment at the pleasure of your employer, who could at any time, for any reason, at least in the US where most employment is what's known as at will, that employer could just at any time let you go. So you go into work literally every day at some risk, even though not a great risk, of having absolutely your entire income stream cut off at a moment's notice, modulo whatever severance package they might give you, or collecting unemployment or things of that nature. So whether you perceive it on a day-to-day basis or not, you probably have the impression that your work is stable, but truly it isn't. And if it goes away, it's kind of all or nothing. It's rare for an employer to call you in and say, hey, we're doing some belt tightening, so we're going to reduce your salary by 33%. Stuff like that might happen, but it's much more common that there's just snap, all gone. And the fact that you don't perceive that risk to exist on a daily basis doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It's just you don't want to think about it. And when it happens, you will scramble. You will go with your phone in your hand right after they walk you out of the building, and you'll be tweeting, hey, I just got fired. Does anybody, whatever. And I don't say this as a knock. It's just the, risk mitigation plan that most employees have is to not think about it and then furiously scramble to find other work when the time comes to think about it. And then you have this whirlwind of interviews and suits and all that, miscellaneous nonsense associated with hiring at organizations. And you do that for a hopefully minimal amount of time. And then you have another similar situation where you take a deep breath because, hey, I finally got back to this single client situation. That is the salaried world when it comes to the risk of your income being cut off. It is, you are going along with this constant risk that all of your income will go away. And what you're banking on outside of them not doing that to you is just your ability to very, very quickly get back into the situation where you perceive low risk, which is where you're employed. Now, let's say you go into business for yourself and you navigate the risk I talked about in the beginning of this stream, which is you decide that you can self-govern and you incur all that upfront uncertainty of going into business for yourself, and now you go and secure a client, your first client. Maybe it's even your old employer. You go and do contract work for them. If you are a freelancer that gets into the business of taking on 3-month or 6-month or 1-year contracts, your risk isn't really substantially different here. If you're doing 40-hour-a-week contract engagements for a term period of time, you've just gotten yourself back into kind of the same situation that you came from in the salaried world. So your risk profile here is about the same. I would say it's slightly lower because if you are taking on gigs for like 6 months or a year, you have more of an expectation that you will have to search for the next gig compared to an employee who typically, assumes that the marriage between employee and employer will last indefinitely until they decide they've had enough. So as a contractor, you are assuming a little bit more turnover in your gigs, and that will likely prompt you to be a little bit better at lining up the next gig and to have maybe a better plan of attack. Maybe you're actually out there on a more regular basis looking for other contracts, or maybe you're even trying to layer in more than one piece of business at a time. So your situation there is probably slightly less risky because you are making finding the next gig more of a first-class part of the approach. Now, that's really at the margins. It's still an equally risky situation. If you're on a contract, let's call it, and assuming they didn't write like an amount into the contract. So if somebody's like, I contract to pay you, $150,000 for a year of labor, I think your situation is somewhat less risky because they have to probably pay you that 150. Well, get into my opinion on contracts. In theory, they have to pay you that because there's a contract. So that might be a little bit less risky if you've agreed to a term of work in advance. But that's not usually what's meant by a contract. It's more like, we'll engage you in a contract for a year and we can cancel that contract with 2 weeks of notice. The person that is doing that, the client in that situation, will probably negotiate something that's as risky or less for them, not you, for them, than employment, because the whole point of having contractors, it's easier and less messy to fire them. So it's rare somebody will give you more of a guarantee as a contractor than they would give to their employees. So your situation as a staff augmentation is going to be very comparable in terms of risk to your situation as an employee. One of the big reasons, by the way, that I don't recommend you do indefinite staff augmentation type freelancing, it's just same risk profile as employment, but with fewer benefits. Now, let's assume that you watch a lot of the videos, live streams, take a lot of the advice I tend to give, and you start to build out more of a book of business. Let's say, for instance, that what you do is you land on a particular service offering that you typically execute in 2 to 4 weeks. And that means that you need to do about, what would that be? Maybe like 20 of them a year in order to make a nice living. So now you're in a situation where you have, let's call it about 20 clients per year. This is dramatically less risky because let's say you're chugging along doing about 20 engagements a year, and then you have a down year, your business starts to, quote, dry up. Drying up in this context doesn't usually mean you go from 20 to 0. It usually means you go from 20 to like 15, maybe 10 in a really down situation. So when you are established as a business or you have a practice, things going south usually means that you have a fraction of the business that you used to have. And usually that fraction isn't catastrophic. It's 2/3, 3/4, 5/6, whatever. So if you were to go out and look at a business like, I don't know, Facebook, um, and I assume because of all the strange decisions they're making, I think their stock price is down. What does it mean for Facebook stock price to be down? What are they off? Like, I don't know, even something like 2/3. I mean, a third of what they were doing, and actually, I don't really know what their stock is off, but even if it were off by 2/3, a third of their market cap is still a lot of money. So when you start to build out a business, a practice, and a book of business, your risk of losing income goes down substantially. Your risk in any given moment of losing a customer is higher because you have a lot more of them, but you have this steady inflow and outflow of business. So what's more likely to happen than you losing all of it, or even the majority of it, is you win some, you lose some. Maybe you lose two and you gain one. So it's really more of an odds and numbers game. And this creates a reduced risk profile for you because the odds of you losing all of your income go almost to zero. It's just super unlikely for that to happen. So really, it becomes more of a question of weathering storms. If a down year for you is 15 customers in a year instead of 20, can you withstand that? Yeah, probably. Especially if you're not running on razor thin margins or living at the edge of your means or what have you. So with more customers in your book of business, the odds of a catastrophic business downturn are lower, and the odds that you can pull certain levers and either ratchet down your expenses or rely on some runway to weather a storm, the odds of that become higher. So on balance, I would say that your risk profile starts to go down when you go into business for yourself and succeed, I should add. Just going into business for yourself doesn't make things less risky. Once you've built a track record and a book of business, your risk profile when it comes to all of your income going away is lower. Now, if you are in business and you start to incur expense, like you bring on employees or you bring on fixed costs to run your business, you invest in some software that helps you do your service delivery, you invest in people that you're paying a salary to, etc. That risk profile can go back up because what are known as fixed cost expenses you have in running your business, you kind of have to pay those no matter what. So if as a business owner, and this is a little bit more intermediate to advanced, but if you are incurring fixed costs and you start to lose business, you have to pay your staff, even if you're not taking profit out of the business. So you can start to incur risk again in the expenses you're incurring as part of your service delivery. But again, you have a lot of control over that. So you can look out ahead at the landscape and say, okay, how much money do I want to reinvest in the business, in staff, in assistance in the form of automation or whatever to help me grow and help with my service delivery. And you can adjust accordingly so you don't have to take on additional staff if it looks like the economy is headed for a downturn. You can pause your spending. And a lot of times when you hear about things like a hiring freeze or something, they're just doing that on a big scale and saying like, I don't know what the future is going to hold, so I'm not really going to invest a lot in doing things that would scale the business. I'm going to try to weather a storm here. Now, as a freelancer doing services, you're typically going to have a relatively minimal set of expenses, and those will largely be within your control. So it really becomes a matter of creating and maintaining a book of business, people that have good things to say to you, people that might want to do work with you from time to time, and just making sure that is a healthy book of business. And when you do that, your risk is going to be lower, all things considered, than the risk of an employee who is effectively putting all their eggs in one basket, which is that of the employer. So hopefully that makes sense. I guess I would summarize by saying the risk of going freelance is sort of high in the short term. You have to make sure you're well suited to do that. You're going to have a learning curve. Things are going to get weird in the beginning. So there is risk associated with that. And then in the early going, you're not going to have much business. So if you get one client and they're providing all of your income, that's really no different than employment. But once you weather that initial kind of startup riskiness, in a steady state, a freelancer with a book of business, lower risk profile in general than a an employee. And perhaps most crucially, you have a lot more control over your risk as a business owner than you do as an employee. You're making those decisions for yourself about whether to take on expense or not. You're making decisions about how to reinvest profit or whether you want to hoard it on the personal side and use it as runway. None of that is up to you as an employee. So your risk is mostly controlled by people that aren't you. And I think for me, that might be the biggest difference now that I think about it. So as a business owner, you're diversifying across a whole book of business, but also you have a lot of control over what risks you take or don't in that situation. And I think that can actually be quite reassuring. So hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully that answers the question, and I will catch you all next time.